The story of David, which David Westfall helped you explore last week, is one of my very favorites. In fact, I use it so often in my life as a chaplain that sometimes I can forget the meaning of it. Because in the life of David, you find everything. You find danger, intrigue, romance, friendship, hate, betrayal, incest, murder, adultery. The list goes on and on. And the reason this story resonates so well with me as a chaplain is that nearly every day I hear somebody's impossible sin. Somebody tells me the sin that they have that they just know God will never forgive. They will tell me about the adultery they committed or the rape, and I've even heard someone tell me they murdered somebody. And many times these stories end with, "Well, what do you think of that, Pastor?" They think that God truly has to be through with them. And I pull out of my back pocket the story of David and how David's life was often a fallen one. And I love pointing out that despite all the sin in David's life, he was called a man after God's own heart. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To begin the story with the beginning of the story, we remember that Pastor Lisa a few weeks ago talked to us about the judges and how the people turned and demanded a king. And they got King Saul, and quickly learned that Saul wasn't all he was cracked up to be. We were actually talking about this in the car ride on the way up. My mom said, "I often wonder why God chose Saul if it wasn't just to tell people, Nana, Nana, boo-boo, you got exactly what you asked for." And scholars actually think that at some point in his kingship, Saul started to literally go mad. He started to go crazy. My dad and I said up on the ride up that a lot of what he does sounds like schizophrenia to us. And it was the point that the prophet is told by Samuel, or God tells the prophet Samuel. And do you remember Samuel? He was the one that was called in the temple in the middle of the night. Samuel, Samuel. He gets up and runs to Eli. Samuel, Samuel. And God tells Samuel that Saul is about to be rejected as the king. And the new king will be one of the sons of Jesse of Bethlehem. So Samuel goes to the house of Jesse. And Jesse does this kind of beauty pageant thing with his sons. And each of them is paraded before Samuel. And Samuel says, "No, no, 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 no. Is that all you got?" No. Exactly. And so Jesse says, "Oh, wait, I forgot. There's one more. He's the youngest, and he's out there tending to the sheep." Samuel says, "Go and get him, because I'm not even going to sit down. I'm not going to let anyone else sit down until you go and get him and bring him to me." So David comes in, and he's this strong and handsome man. The Bible actually tells us he's a redhead. Which is pretty unusual in that time. And so David comes in, and he's this good-looking, strong man, and Samuel tells him that the Lord has chosen him to be the anointed one, that he is going to be the next king of Israel, and he takes oil and anoints David's forehead in front of his father and his brothers. And from that day on, David's life is never the same. He's a talented musician, and soon gets noticed enough that he goes to Saul's house and starts to play his harp for Saul. And so David continues playing his harp, and he's getting more and more famous in the kingdom, and Saul is going mad. And the only thing that will really calm him down is when David plays. So David will sit and play his harp for him to try and calm Saul down for as much time as he can. Eventually he becomes Saul's armor bearer, meaning he carries around the heavy armor that Saul wears out in battle and then helps Saul get dressed whenever he goes into battle. And so he goes off to war with the Philistines and with Saul, and that war had gotten really, really bad. And this one summer there was a standoff with the Israelites on one side and the Philistines on the other side, and neither were willing to make a move. You know, like when you watch two dogs and they're sitting there staring at each other, and both of them are just kind of waiting? That's what was going on. And so finally, one of the giants from the Philistine army steps out into the middle. And he steps into the land between the two armies, and he starts to taunt the Israelites. And he wants them to go mano-a-mano. Instead of killing everybody, he says, just bring one person out to fight me. Winner takes all. And they're no takers. It's a shocker. And David is so embarrassed by the lack of bravery in the Israelite camp that he steps forward with a simple slingshot. Now, David's no novice. As a shepherd, he would have used this slingshot a lot. He would have used it to scare away wolves, and so he'd have been a pretty good shot. And he picks up his slingshot, and he slings it around and lets it go, and it hits Saul in that special place right in between the eyes that knocks him out, cold, onto the ground. David steps up and cuts off his head, and the victory goes to the Israelites. And the success continues. For the rest of the summer, and when the people of Israel, for the rest of the summer, they keep winning. And the Israelites return, and there is a great, massive festival in the streets. And the people are singing about their victory. And one of them states that Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his 10,000s. Not a great thing to a man to say who's already paranoid. And so Saul begins to hatch this plan to kill David. But he doesn't want to do it outright because the people are singing about him, and he doesn't want the people to turn on him. So he starts to devise a plan to just get David killed. And he realizes that his daughter's in love with David, and David's in love with his daughter. And he tells David, you can marry my daughter if, this is a good one, you bring back 100 Philistine foreskins as a dowry. The plan, of course, is that in the process of doing this, David will die by the Philistines. But David jauntily comes back with 200 foreskins. And Saul's getting a little fed up with this. He's getting a little fed up with David kind of moving through. And so he simply decides to go with outright murder, because that just seems a lot easier at this point. But at this point, Jonathan and David have gained a sort of friendship. And Jonathan is one of Saul's sons. And Jonathan talks Saul out of killing David. And for some reason, Saul decides to put down his plot, at least for a little while. But the madness strikes again. And David comes in with his harp, and he begins to play. And all of a sudden, Saul is so enraged that he picks up a spear and hurls it at David. David dodges out of the way and runs. And runs and runs and runs. And he escapes into exile. And over that time that David's in exile, the country goes way downhill. But David continues to gain strength. And he brings together this army. And this army is fighting Philistines, and it's keeping David safe. And they get a chance to kill Saul. And David's standing there, and he's looking over Saul when he's sleeping. And he walks away. And David says that Saul is king, and will remain king until God deems that it's David's turn. When Saul hears this, he lays off for a little while. That doesn't last for long. And he decides to try and kill David again. And David once again is able to corner Saul and spares Saul's life. But he's also beginning to realize that as long as Saul's alive, he is never going to be safe. And he goes further into exile, actually outside the kingdom of Israel this time, which means he's not able to worship, he's not able to have the communion with his fellow believers that he's enjoyed all of his life. But David's off at this time, and he's plundering Philistine villages, and Saul's 3 sons, including Jonathan, all die in battle. And then Saul gets wounded, mortally wounded, and then he dies. And a servant takes his crown, and he sees this as an opportunity to get on the good side of David. And he goes over to David, and he tells a fib. And he says, Saul was ill, he was bad, I wanted to keep the other army from capturing him, so I killed him. This would have been an act of mercy in biblical times. He was thinking there was automatically something that would endear him to David. But David looks at him, and he asks the servant why he wasn't afraid to kill the Lord's anointed man and sentences this man to death. And so now David becomes the anointed king. But he has competition. Saul's not done yet. And also one of Saul's sons is appointed king. So for 7.5 years, David reigns the kingdom of Judah, and Ishabeth reigns the kingdom of Israel. So there are two separate kingdoms. The kingdoms are divided at this point. And it turns out that Ishabeth, one of Saul's sons, is actually kind of a puppet king. And Saul's former advisor, Abner, is the puppet master. And Abner dies. And the kingdom of Israel goes into absolute chaos, which makes it easy for David to sweep right in and take it over. And his first order of business is to reestablish the Ark of the Covenant. If you remember when Lisa was talking, the Ark had been taken out of Israel by the Philistines, but returned promptly when it kept bringing them plagues. The Israelites didn't really know what to do with this Ark after it was returned, so they just let it sit there and stared at it for a good while. And you got to remember, David's been in exile, so he hasn't had a chance to worship. So this is going to be something that's important to him. So the first thing he does is he sets out to bring the Ark back. And he's so excited by this prospect. He's so excited by this Ark being brought through the streets of Israel that he starts to dance. And he starts to dance so wild. And Scripture actually tells us he was dancing so hard, he actually exposes himself to everybody around. Pants fly up. Now that is some passionate worship. I don't think that was what you had in mind when we were singing Great is Thy Faithfulness with gusto. And so his wife gets angry, and he and his wife have an explosive fight, and they never actually reconcile from that, one of his wives. And so David begins to build a temple to put the ark in. And Nathan, who's the new prophet after Samuel dies, informs David that this temple will not be finished by him, but he will have a child, and the child will finish the temple. And at some point after this, that things really go downhill for David. Something switches off in his head, and he starts to get really complacent in life. And so one year when the Israelites are going to battle, he decides to stay home instead of go and lead them. And so he's home, and he's bored. And he has a high-ranking officer named Uriah. And Uriah has a beautiful wife named Bathsheba. And one night when Uriah's at war, David goes up onto his rooftop. And at this time, women's bathhouses were on the roofs of buildings and had a high privacy fence around them. But the palace would have been so tall that David was able to look over and into the bathhouse. Now, call me crazy, but David had to know that was there. This wasn't one of those, oops, I just found it accidentally things. This had to be something that was going on for a little while. But David looks over and he sees the most gorgeous woman he has ever seen in his entire life. And he thinks to himself, I just have to have her. And so he sends for her. She comes over, and they spend some time together, and then she ends up pregnant. The unfortunate part is that her husband is a high-ranking officer named Uriah. So David decides to send for Uriah to hide his sin. He figures if Uriah can come home and spend time with his wife, he'll think that the child is his. Uriah comes home, and David has this great feast, and there's lots of wine flowing, and Uriah gets a little drunk, and David sends him home. Go home to your wife. Uriah says, no, my men are sleeping in tents. I can't go home and have a good evening with my wife when all the men are in such dire situations back on the battlefield. So he sleeps in the servants' quarters at David's place. David's a little frustrated, and so he does it a second night. And the second night, it still doesn't go as planned. So David writes a letter and sends a letter back with Uriah. And in this letter is a command that he's to go to the very front line. The line where people are most likely to be killed. and he has Bathsheba's husband killed. He quickly afterwards marries Bathsheba, and they have a son. And the prophet Nathan comes to David, and he tells David a story about a lamb and how a man had just one little lamb, and the lamb ate from his plate and sat in his lap and was a member of his family, and then a rich man came by and took that lamb. And Nathan asked David what should happen. And David said, surely that man should die. And Nathan said, that man is you. Gotcha. And so the consequence for this is that God takes David and Bathsheba's son, which hardly seems fair to me, but it's what happens. And the son gets very, very sick, and David goes into an intense period of mourning, wailing, gnashing of teeth, tearing his clothes, praying, begging God to spare the life of his young son. And God doesn't. And his son dies. And after the death of his son, the family just falls into further disarray. One of the most disturbing stories, I think, in the Bible describes David's son Amnon, who fell in love with his half-sister named Tamar. In those days, a marriage between half-siblings really wasn't all that unusual, and if Amnon had asked, he very likely could have married Tamar without a problem. But Amnon one night decides that he's going to fake sick and asks for Tamar to come and serve him some food. And she does, and he asks for her to sleep with him. And she says no. And so he rapes her. And Tamar begins to weep. And when she starts to cry, Amnon no longer sees the beautiful princess that was, but abused and wounded girl. And he hates her. So he sends her away by force. Now, the law of Moses is really particular in what happens during rape. The law of Moses says that the penalty is either a shotgun wedding or death. And David, as the head of his household, should be the one to execute this justice. But he does nothing. He takes no steps to punish Ammon's crime. None. It goes completely undetected. So somebody else steps up and punishes Ammon. Tamar had a full brother named Absalom, who understands now that Tamar's life's over. She's ruined. And so he avenges her by killing Ammon in a public setting and has to run for his life. David eventually forgives him, but he's never really welcomed back in the royal residence. And eventually, Absalom rebels and tries to take over David's country. And then what ensues from there is just a whole lot of royal backbiting. Princes trying to take crowns and kill. They kill each other, they try and kill their dad, and it's all in the name of becoming the next king. And the Bible seems to indicate that over the next years, as David ages, he starts to become senile, almost kind of an Alzheimer kind of deal. And towards the end of his reign, Bathsheba realizes what's going on, and she wants her son Solomon to be king. This is the son that was conceived after their first son died. And David has a lucid moment. And he appoints Solomon as king while he is still alive, which is a really unusual move in this time. You almost always had to wait for the king to die before you could be king. So Solomon becomes king, and David just kind of fades into the background. What a story. What a story. As I studied and reflected on it, I couldn't help but think that it really doesn't seem like David is so much of a man after God's own heart. It seems to me that David is kind of a naive boy who follows God wholeheartedly until he sees a toy that he can't have, and then he walks away from that morality. God seems to punish David for the rest of his life, and David seems to struggle with sin and punishment. To me, that doesn't really seem like someone who's after God's own heart. But then again, I can't see his heart. When Samuel was chosen to be a prophet, God told him that man looks at outward things, but the Lord looks at the heart. That despite David's sin, disgrace, and eventual shambles of his family, there was something that God held on to. And David held on to God with this ferocious kind of love. One of my favorite theologians of our time is Rob Bell. He's become famous in the last few years for his Pneuma videos. It's one of my mom's favorite stories is a story of his son and a red ball. And this red ball shows up on the kitchen counter junk bowl. And his wife asks where it came from. And he goes, I don't know. And so they call their son in. And the younger son says he doesn't know where it came from either. And they ask the older one. And Rob Bell says it was like he was possessed by the spirit of Steve Urkel. I don't know where it came from. How'd that get there? I've never seen it. Have you seen that ball? It's the weirdest thing. The ball just showed up in the bowl. I don't know where that came from. They kind of hee-haw about it and forget about the incident until a few days later when Rob is at work and his wife is home with the kids. And the kids are playing in another room when one of them starts to cry, and the wife goes to investigate. The younger one says that the older one hit him. And once again, the Steve Urkel spirit comes out. Did I do that? I didn't do that. It was the weirdest thing. All of a sudden he was crying. I don't know why. And his wife looks at her son and she goes, uh-huh. Just like you don't know where the red ball came from. You know that moment when all your junk catches up with you? And you have this kind of cosmic gotcha moment? The older son, his face drops and he turns and he runs out of the room. And on his way home, his wife calls him and tells him about the incident. When Rob gets home, he walks in the door, and he checks the downstairs rooms, and his son isn't in the room. And he goes upstairs, and he checks his son's room. He's not there. And then he checks the younger son's room, and he's not there either. Then he checks the bathroom. His son's not there either. And finally, he goes into his bedroom. And in the middle of his bed, underneath the covers, is one perfect round lump. And he sits down on the bed, and he pulls back the covers. The little boy's sitting there with a tear-stained face. Sweat has plastered the hair to his face from all the sweating underneath those hot, sticky covers and the crying and the hyperventilating. And Rob looks at his son, and he says, nothing you will ever do will make me love you less. Nothing. The little boy cries and crawls up into his lap. And they continue on. Nothing you can ever do will make God love you less. Do you hear me? Nothing. Being a person after God's own heart doesn't mean doing everything right. It means being willing to pull back the covers and crawl up into God's lap instead of keeping on with hiding. As we move into time of communion today, I want you to think about what's keeping you from crawling out from underneath the covers. What's your unspeakable sin? What's your thing that's keeping you from a right relationship with God? Now's the time and space. Pull back those covers.